What happens when a species stops being afraid? There's a strange pattern hidden throughout the history of life. Again and again, evolution creates animals that stop being afraid. Not because they become stronger, not because they become smarter, but because for a very long time, nothing threatens them. Imagine living in a world where no predator hunts you, nothing chases you, nothing waits in the dark, nothing turns you into food. Generation after generation, fear becomes less useful, and over thousands of years, something remarkable happens. The instinct to stay alert begins to fade. At first, this sounds like an evolutionary success story. After all, fear is expensive. It consumes energy. It distracts from feeding, mating, and raising offspring. Why waste precious resources worrying about dangers that don't exist? But history reveals a disturbing pattern. Many species that stopped being afraid eventually became some of the most vulnerable animals on Earth, and when danger finally returned, they often had no idea how to respond. The science behind this phenomenon reveals something much larger than animal behavior. It exposes one of evolution's deepest trade-offs. Because fear isn't just an emotion, it's a survival technology, and when a species loses it, the consequences can reshape entire ecosystems or erase a species altogether. Most people think of fear as a universal feature of life. A predator appears, the prey runs. Simple. But fear is not fixed, it evolves. Every generation inherits behavioral tendencies shaped by the environment of previous generations. In dangerous environments, cautious individuals often survive longer. They notice threats sooner. They avoid unnecessary risks. They pass their genes on. Over time, fear becomes deeply embedded within the species. But what happens when danger disappears? That's where evolution begins conducting one of its most fascinating experiments. Researchers have repeatedly observed that animals living in predator-free environments behave very differently from their relatives elsewhere. They spend less time scanning for danger. They allow potential threats to approach more closely. Some become astonishingly bold. The strange part is that these changes can happen gradually and almost invisibly. Nothing appears wrong. The species thrives. Population numbers grow. Life becomes easier. But hidden beneath that success, an ancient survival system may be quietly disappearing. And history shows that this process often ends the same way, with a predator arriving where one didn't exist before.
One of the most famous examples comes from islands. For millions of years, islands have served as natural laboratories of evolution. Separated from continents by vast oceans, many islands lacked large predators. Animals that evolved there faced very different selective pressures than animals on the mainland. Take the dodo. Living on Mauritius, the dodo evolved in an environment with few natural threats. It became flightless. It nested on the ground. Historical accounts suggest it showed little fear of humans. For thousands of years, this strategy worked perfectly. Then, sailors arrived. Within a remarkably short period, the species vanished. The dodo's extinction is often presented as a story about hunting, but many scientists view it as something deeper. It was a collision between two evolutionary worlds. One evolved for safety, the other brought danger, and evolution couldn't adapt quickly enough. But the dodo wasn't unique. Researchers studying island birds, reptiles, and mammals have repeatedly found similar patterns. Scientists often measure something called flight initiation distance. This is the distance at which an animal decides to flee from a potential threat. The results are striking. Animals exposed to predators usually flee early. Animals living in predator-free environments often allow much closer approaches, sometimes dramatically closer. These findings reveal an important truth. Fear is not a permanent setting. It is shaped by evolutionary history, and sometimes that history changes. At this point, the story seems straightforward. Remove predators. Animals become less fearful. Predators return. Animals suffer. Case closed. Except researchers discovered something much stranger. Fear influences far more than survival during predator attacks. Fear can shape entire ecosystems. One of the most famous examples comes from Yellowstone National Park. When wolves disappeared from Yellowstone during the 20th century, elk populations expanded. Without predators nearby, elk changed their behavior. They spent more time feeding in open areas. They browsed heavily on young trees and vegetation. Over time, parts of the landscape began to change. Then, wolves returned. The obvious expectation was that wolves would affect the ecosystem by killing elk. And they did. Even when wolves weren't actively hunting, elk behaved differently. They avoided certain locations. They became more cautious. They spent less time feeding in exposed areas. The landscape itself began recovering. Trees returned. Vegetation rebounded. Entire ecological relationships shifted. Scientists call this phenomenon the ecology of fear. The presence of predators changes behavior, and behavior changes ecosystems, which raises an extraordinary question. If fear can shape landscapes, rivers, forests, and food chains, what happens when fear disappears completely? The answer is often instability, because fear isn't simply a reaction, it's information, a constant stream of biological warnings guiding decisions every day. But researchers eventually uncovered something even more surprising. Fear is not always genetic. In many species, fear can be learned. Young vervet monkeys learn predator recognition from older monkeys. Birds learn alarm calls from experienced adults. Elephants appear capable of transmitting knowledge about danger across generations. In some species, fear functions partly as culture. Knowledge survives because experienced individuals teach younger ones what to avoid. This means a species can lose fear in more than one way. Evolution can remove it, or knowledge can disappear. The implications are enormous, because once a population loses generations of accumulated survival knowledge, rebuilding it can be difficult, sometimes impossible. And that's when the mystery begins to look surprisingly familiar. Humans are an unusual species in this story. Unlike many animals, we live in environments that are safer than almost any our ancestors experienced. Most people rarely encounter predators. Food is accessible. Shelter is abundant. Medicine protects us from dangers that once killed millions. Yet fear remains deeply embedded within the human brain. Why? Because evolution moves slowly. Civilization moves quickly. The neural systems that evolved to protect ancient humans still operate inside modern environments. Fear of darkness, fear of isolation, fear of sudden movement, fear of unknown individuals. Many of these responses developed because they increase survival in dangerous environments. The threats may have changed, the brain has not completely caught up. This creates a fascinating contrast. Many island species became vulnerable because they lost fear. Humans often struggle because we retained so much of it. Yet both situations reveal the same evolutionary principle. Fear exists because historically it worked. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but effectively. The purpose of fear was never happiness. Its purpose was survival. Perhaps the most surprising lesson is that fear is not the opposite of safety. In many ways, fear is what created safety in the first place. It pushed animals to avoid danger. It encouraged caution. It rewarded vigilance. And over millions of years, it became one of evolution's most successful inventions. When species stop being afraid, the change often feels invisible. Life continues normally. The world appears peaceful. Nothing seems wrong. Until something changes. A new predator arrives. A new threat emerges. And suddenly, the absence of fear becomes visible. Not as freedom, but as vulnerability. The history of life suggests that survival has never belonged solely to the strongest creatures, or the smartest, or the fastest. Often, it belonged to those that could sense danger before danger arrived. Because sometimes, the most important survival skill is not knowing how to fight, it's knowing when to be afraid. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, subscribe for more. See you in the next one.